In 1409, a 26-year-old prince inherited one of the most powerful cities in the world. His grandfather had been Timur, Tamerlane, the conqueror who had built an empire larger than Alexander's. His father expected him to continue the family business, war, conquest, expansion. Instead, he did something that would get him killed. He built an observatory. He mapped 1,018 stars. He calculated the length of the year to within 58 seconds, without telescopes, a precision modern scientists wouldn't surpass for centuries. He turned a warrior's capital into the scientific center of the medieval world. And 40 years later, his own son had him beheaded for it. This is the story of Ulugh Beg, the astronomer-king who proved that sometimes the greatest empires are built not with swords, but with knowledge, and how choosing books over battles cost him everything.
The Silk Road still has secrets.
To understand why Ulugh Beg's choice was so radical, you need to understand what he inherited. When Timur died in 1405, trying to conquer China, his empire immediately began tearing itself apart. His 4 sons went to war. The empire that had taken 35 years to build fractured in months. Cities that Timur had conquered burned again, this time destroyed by his own descendants fighting over scraps. By 1409, Timur's 4th son, Shahrukh, had won. He controlled the empire. But Shahrukh was different from his father. He'd seen what endless conquest cost. So he made a strategic decision. He moved the capital from Samarkand to Herat, in what's now Afghanistan. Herat would be the political center, but Samarkand, Timur's jewel, the city with the turquoise domes and the Registan Square, needed a governor. Shahrukh appointed his own son to the position. His name was Muhammad Taragai. History knows him as Ulugh Beg, which means great ruler. Ulugh Beg was 26 years old, and he was nothing like his grandfather. Where Timur had been a warrior since childhood, Ulugh Beg had grown up in libraries. Where Timur studied military strategy, Ulugh Beg studied mathematics. Where Timur collected craftsmen and architects, Ulugh Beg collected scholars and astronomers. His father, Shahrukh, had given him the clearest instruction: govern Samarkand, maintain order, collect taxes, don't start wars. Simple enough. But Ulugh Beg looked at the city his grandfather had built, the madrasas, the libraries, the infrastructure designed to showcase power, and he saw something else. He saw potential. Timur had built Samarkand to prove he was the greatest conqueror. Ulugh Beg would use it to prove something entirely different, that knowledge could be a greater empire than any army. In 1420, 11 years into his governorship, Ulugh Beg began his most ambitious project. Not a palace, not a fortress, an observatory. But this wasn't just a building for looking at stars. This was a statement, a declaration that Samarkand's golden age wouldn't be defined by conquest, but by discovery. The location was deliberate, on a hillside outside the city walls. Ulugh Beg wanted it visible from Samarkand. He wanted everyone to see that their governor was building something the world had never seen. The main instrument was revolutionary, a massive sextant, 3 stories tall, built directly into the hillside. The scale is hard to imagine. The radius was over 130 feet. The arc was carved into solid rock and lined with marble. 2 parallel rails ran along the arc, marked with precise degree measurements down to minutes and seconds. Why so large? Because in astronomy, size equals precision. The bigger your instrument, the more accurately you can measure. And Ulugh Beg wanted precision medieval Europe couldn't imagine. He recruited the best minds he could find: Ali Kuschi, a brilliant mathematician from Persia; Qadi Zada al-Rumi, an astronomer who studied the Greek classics; Ghiyath al-Din Jamshid al-Kashi, who calculated pi to 16 decimal places, a record that stood for 200 years. These weren't court decorations, these were working scientists. And Ulugh Beg didn't just fund them, he worked alongside them. Contemporary accounts describe him spending nights at the observatory, taking measurements, checking calculations, debating theories. The goal was ambitious: create a new star catalog. The last comprehensive one had been made by the Greek astronomer Ptolemy in 150 AD, over 1,200 years earlier. Ulugh Beg wanted to do better. The work was painstaking. To map a single star required multiple observations over months to account for the Earth's rotation, atmospheric refraction, and instrumental error. They had to develop new trigonometric tables. They had to calculate the obliquity of the ecliptic, the tilt of Earth's axis. They had to measure the precession of the equinoxes. And they had to do all of this without telescopes. Those wouldn't be invented for another 180 years. By 1437, after 17 years of work, they completed it. The Zij-i Sultani, the Sultan's Tables, a star catalog mapping 1,018 stars with unprecedented accuracy. They calculated the length of the year to 365 days, 6 hours, 10 minutes, and 8 seconds. The actual length is 365 days, 6 hours, 9 minutes, and 10 seconds. They were off by 58 seconds. After 17 years of naked-eye observations using medieval instruments. To put this in perspective, this level of precision wouldn't be matched in Europe until Tycho Brahe 150 years later, and Brahe had better instruments and stood on the shoulders of Renaissance astronomy. Ulugh Beg was working in relative isolation, building on Islamic astronomical tradition, pushing the boundaries of what humans could measure. But the observatory was just the beginning. Ulugh Beg's vision went beyond astronomy. He wanted to transform all of Samarkand into a center of learning. The madrasas, the Islamic schools that Timur had built as monuments, became working universities. And not just for religious studies. Ulugh Beg established curricula in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, logic, and theology. In 1420, he personally founded the Ulugh Beg Madrasa on the Registan Square. It still stands today. The inscription above the entrance reads, "The pursuit of knowledge is the duty of every Muslim man and Muslim woman." Students came from across the Islamic world, from Cairo, from Baghdad, from Damascus, from as far as Delhi. They came because Samarkand offered something unique: the chance to study with the world's leading astronomers, funded by a ruler who was himself a working scientist. The curriculum was rigorous. Students spent years mastering Euclid's geometry. They studied Ptolemy's Almagest. They learned algebra, which had been invented by Al-Khwarizmi, who had studied in Merv before the Mongols destroyed it. They studied optics, mechanics, medicine. And critically, they didn't just learn, they advanced. Ulugh Beg's scholars developed new trigonometric tables that were more accurate than anything produced in Europe. They refined algebraic techniques. They made advances in calendar calculation that would influence both Islamic and Christian timekeeping. This was the Timurid Renaissance. While Europe was still recovering from the Black Death and 100 Years' War, while most Europeans couldn't read and cities were still primitive, Samarkand was calculating planetary orbits and performing cataract surgeries with instruments Europe wouldn't have for 200 years. The city Timur had built with forced labor and blood became a magnet for scholars by choice. The treasure Timur had extracted through conquest was now funding the creation of knowledge. Ulugh Beg himself taught mathematics and astronomy. Contemporary accounts describe him holding public lectures on the Registan Square, explaining celestial mechanics to anyone who wanted to learn: nobles, merchants, craftsmen. He believed knowledge shouldn't be hoarded. But there was a problem that would eventually kill him. Not everyone approved. In the 1440s, conservative religious clerics in Samarkand began openly criticizing Ulugh Beg. Their objections were partly theological, partly political, and entirely dangerous. The theological argument went like this: Ulugh Beg was spending too much time on worldly sciences, astronomy, mathematics, philosophy, and not enough on Islamic jurisprudence and theology. They argued that studying the stars was vanity, that attempting to measure God's creation with human instruments was impious, that a ruler's duty was to enforce religious law, not chase celestial coordinates. But Ulugh Beg had made it personal. He had built the largest observatory in the Islamic world. He had recruited scholars who studied Greek philosophy, texts some clerics considered corrupted. He had elevated science to the same status as religious study. Worse, from the cleric's perspective, he was popular. Students loved him, merchants respected him. Samarkand was prospering. It was hard to argue against success. So the clerics found another angle: politics. Ulugh Beg had a son, Abd al-Latif, and Abd al-Latif was nothing like his father. Where Ulugh Beg was scholarly, Abd al-Latif was ambitious. Where Ulugh Beg avoided military conflict, Abd al-Latif craved power. Where Ulugh Beg studied stars, Abd al-Latif studied his father's weaknesses. And the conservative clerics whispered in Abd al-Latif's ear. By 1449, Ulugh Beg was 67 years old. He'd ruled Samarkand for 40 years. The observatory had been completed. The Zij-i-Sultani was finished. His life's work was done. But Abd al-Latif saw a throne occupied by an old man more interested in mathematics than power. He saw an opportunity. In September 1449, Abd al-Latif raised an army, not against a foreign enemy, against his own father. The justification was wrapped in religious language. Ulugh Beg had neglected his duties as a Muslim ruler. He had prioritized science over faith. He had allowed dangerous ideas to spread. But the real reason was simpler. Abd al-Latif wanted power, and his father was in the way. Ulugh Beg could have fought. He still controlled Samarkand. He had loyal followers, but he was a mathematician, not a warrior. He'd spent his life avoiding the kind of violence his grandfather had perfected. So he tried negotiation. He offered to abdicate peacefully. He asked only to be allowed to retire to Mecca, to spend his final years in pilgrimage. Abd al-Latif agreed. It was a lie. On October 27, 1449, Ulugh Beg left Samarkand for Mecca, or so he thought. He was traveling with a small group, a few servants, a couple of loyal scholars, no army, no guards. He was a mathematician on pilgrimage, not a warrior expecting betrayal. Abd al-Latif's soldiers intercepted them just outside the city. According to historical accounts, and we have several because this event shocked the Islamic world, Ulugh Beg knew immediately what was happening. There was no confusion, no false hope. He understood. One account says he asked to pray one final time. The soldiers allowed it. Another account says he asked to see the stars one last time. That request was denied. What we know for certain, on October 27, 1449, Ulugh Beg was beheaded. The astronomer-king who had mapped 1,018 stars, who had calculated the year within 58 seconds, who had built the greatest observatory in the medieval world, was killed by his own son's soldiers. He was 67 years old. He'd ruled Samarkand for 40 years. He'd never started a war, he'd never conquered a city, he'd never built a pyramid of skulls. He had only built knowledge, and it got him killed. Abd al-Latif took power in Samarkand. His reign lasted 6 months. In April 1450, Abd al-Latif was assassinated by his own supporters. The throne he'd killed his father to claim brought him nothing but a quick death. Within 2 years, Samarkand fell to rival factions. The scholars began to leave. Some fled to Persia, others went to India. They took their knowledge with them, spreading Ulugh Beg's astronomical innovations across the Islamic world. The observatory fell into disrepair. Without Ulugh Beg's funding and protection, there was no one to maintain it. The instruments were looted, the building crumbled. Within a generation, it was forgotten. The madrasas on the Registan continued, but without the scientific focus. They returned to traditional religious studies. The dream of Samarkand as a scientific capital died with Ulugh Beg. In 1501, the Uzbek Khanate conquered Samarkand. The Timurid dynasty, Timur's bloodline, ended. 131 years after Timur had built his empire, his descendants lost it all. But something survived. The Zij-i-Sultani, Ulugh Beg's star catalog, survived. Copies had been made and distributed to other observatories and libraries before his death. Scholars in Cairo had it. Astronomers in Istanbul studied it. It spread across the Islamic world and eventually reached Europe. When European astronomers began their own celestial mapping in the 1500s, they used Ulugh Beg's tables as their baseline. Tycho Brahe, the famous Danish astronomer, praised Ulugh Beg's precision. Copernicus studied his work. Johannes Kepler referenced the Zij-i-Sultani when developing his laws of planetary motion. The man who mapped the stars without telescopes became the foundation for the astronomical revolution that would come 200 years after his death. In 1908, Russian archaeologists excavating near Samarkand found something extraordinary: the ruins of Ulugh Beg's observatory. The massive sexton trench was still there, carved into the hillside, exactly as he'd built it. They found calculation tablets, instrument fragments, evidence of the precision he'd achieved. Today, it's a museum. Astronomers from around the world visit to pay respect. The sextant trench remains a monument to what humans could achieve with determination, mathematics, and curiosity. In 1941, Soviet scientists opened Ulugh Beg's tomb in Samarkand. They found his skeleton, and they confirmed the historical accounts. He had been beheaded. The skull was separated from the body. The astronomer-king's violent death was verified by archaeology. But here's what's remarkable. Today in Uzbekistan, Ulugh Beg is a national hero. There are statues of him in Tashkent. His face appears on currency. His madrasa on the Registan is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Thousands of tourists visit every year. The man who was killed for choosing knowledge over power is now celebrated precisely because he made that choice. His grandfather, Timur, is remembered too, statues, symbols of national pride. But when Uzbek school children learn their history, they're taught about both Timur, the conqueror, and Ulugh Beg, the scientist. One built an empire through violence, the other built knowledge through curiosity. Both are honored, both are remembered, but one legacy required swords, and the other required only patience, mathematics, and a hillside in Samarkand. The Taj Mahal, built by Ulugh Beg's distant relative Babur's descendants, stands as proof of Timur's architectural influence, but the astronomical techniques used to orient that building precisely, those came from Ulugh Beg. In the end, Ulugh Beg proved something his grandfather never could. that knowledge is a more powerful empire than conquest, because armies can be defeated, cities can be destroyed, empires can fall. But an idea, a calculation, a star chart, those can travel across centuries and continents. Those can't be killed, even when the person who created them is beheaded on a dusty road outside Samarkand. Ulugh Beg's observatory crumbled, his dynasty ended, his own son killed him, but his stars remain, and 600 years later, we still look up at the same sky he mapped, with instruments he would barely recognize, built on mathematics he helped preserve. That's legacy.
Ulugh Beg chose knowledge over power. It cost him his life, but it earned him immortality. This is what happens when science meets politics, when curiosity challenges tradition, when someone dares to ask, what if there's a better way to build an empire than with swords? The Silk Road is full of stories like this, people who chose differently, who built differently, who thought differently, and most of them paid a price. Next, we're uncovering the lost cities themselves, the top 10 cities of the Silk Road you've never heard of. Some survived, some vanished, all of them changed history. Click the link at the top of your screen to see which lost city was even richer than Samarkand. Subscribe to Secrets of Silk Road. We reveal these forgotten stories every day. Thanks for watching, and remember, the greatest conquests aren't made with armies, they're made with ideas.